I think where we're headed with this is, if I follow the script that we kind of laid out, is we're going to start talking about what we call reference architecture versus reference implementation, and really getting underneath the patterns that that really underlie like all the agile methodologies, and really talking about, if you understand those patterns, how do you start like customizing and tailoring methodology to make it work within your particular context, right? Okay, so cool. So we're talking about agile transformation, right? So we're gonna put this up here, right? So agile transformation, that's the thing I always like to talk about. And what we did really over the course of the last couple weeks is we introduced a couple of concepts, right? So we talked about the three things. And so we'll just hit that just really quick. And then we talked about the 4 quadrants. We'll recap that as well. Then we talked about this notional idea that we have called expeditions and base camps, right? And what we're going to go in today is an idea that is really integral to like how we align organizations in doing transformation work, really called outcomes-based planning. And right, and so we're going to talk about how to manage a transformation, how to create some structure and some discipline around it. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, right? So the underlying concept behind the 3 things talk was that we have this theory of transformation that basically says that an agile transformation is about forming teams, building backlogs, and producing a working tested product, right? And where all this stuff came out of, right? And I don't want to, I know we've gone over this for the last couple of weeks, so I don't want to like hit it too hard, but it's like where all this stuff came from is I was going in and teaching people Scrum 10, 12 years ago, and some scaled stuff, early scaled stuff, and even some RUP stuff back in the day. And what I was finding is that you had a lot of people that were really getting good at the mechanics of doing the agile stuff, but they were really bad at forming complete cross-functional teams, right? And so this idea of forming teams, getting them a really clear backlog, right? And by backlog, I mean, what we learned from Mike Cohn back in the day, a card, a conversation, a confirmation. I guess that was actually Ron Jeffries, but you get the idea, right? The invest model: independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small, and testable. Backlogs are epically bad in a lot of the organizations we go into. And then the ability to produce this working tested increment of software, right, that actually provides some value to the customer. And it's, so what was interesting is what kind of started this for us and started us down this line of thinking around the transformation journey is that if I could get the team structure right, 6 to 8 people that are really aligned to value, a product or a feature set or a business capability or a value stream or something like that, right? And I encapsulate them, basically meaning that I don't have a lot of dependencies between them and the rest of the organization. And I get them a really, really clear, strategically aligned backlog. And I put the technical infrastructure in place and the testing infrastructure in place to be able to get to this working tested increment of product at the end of the sprint. It almost doesn't matter what methodology you use. Promise you, right? But let's say you wrap it in XP, you wrap it in Scrum. I'm trying to think of like other small team methodologies, right? You could even use something like Crystal Clear, right? The thing is that if I get this stuff right, this stuff gets way easier. Okay. And so now we start talking about scale, and we start talking about like networks of teams and kind of hierarchies of teams, right? Operating off of kind of governance. I hope this makes sense. These are supposed to be like Kanban queues, right? Governance queues, and getting to a place where we can actually measure, flow-based metrics over here on the other side, right? And so this idea of the 3 things is that if I can get backlogs, teams, working tested software straight, and then I can get governance, structure, and metrics straight, right, I'm going to win, right? Because in order to do SAFe correctly, I have to have a team-based organizational structure. I have to be organized around value streams. I have to be organized around something that's encapsulated. I have to have a way of flowing work into that organization, and I have to have some way of being able to measure on the backside if that organization is performing the way we want it to. The thing that makes that hard, and the reason why people don't do it, is because they're dealing with dependencies, right? All over dependencies, right? They're dealing with dependencies all over the organization. So dependencies can come in the way of organizational design, can come in the way of requirements and coordination. It can be technical dependencies, things interlocked all across the technical architecture. Technical debt can be kind of a form of dependencies. And so what my belief is that the work of the transformation is figuring out how to build these kinds of teams, backlogs, and the infrastructure to produce working tested software, how to install the right level of governance, right, and the right team-based organizational structures, and then recognizing that these dependencies in the organization are what actually get in the way. They're the impediments, and we have to eliminate dependencies between teams. And then if we think in that frame of reference, like it doesn't really matter whether we do SAFe or LESS or disciplined agile delivery or Scrum, right? It can all be like very contextual, and whatever it is that we're doing is way more likely to work because we created the conditions for that methodology to be successful. And so our fight, right, the things that I think are important in industry right now is that we're kind of myopically focused on process and methodology and the things that we do and the ceremonies and the roles and the responsibilities and all that stuff. And we've kind of lost sight of the organizational structure stuff, right? So build towards the organizational structure that you need to do the agile method that you want to do, and then just recognize that you're going to have to break dependencies over time, okay? And that's the work of a transformation, right? So that was really the topic behind three things. And then in the four quadrants, one of the things we want to recognize is that different organizations are in different places as a starting place, and they have different destinations. And so we start to layer on top of the three things, what does it look like to define where you are? And so we introduced this idea of predictability versus adaptability, emergence versus convergence. And so predictable is like pretty easy, right? We want to be able to make and meet commitments, right? If we are adaptable, we want to be able to respond to change. What's a little harder to explain sometimes is if I'm emergent, what I'm basically saying is that requirements can emerge. I hate to use kind of a recursive definition, but requirements can emerge based upon our evolving understanding of what the client wants or is willing to buy. So we're going to say, I like to draw this one, right? So it's like we kind of like have a starting place, and the requirements are going to kind of be all over the place, or they're going to expand, or we're going to learn more about them. Convergent is this idea of we have an idea of where we want to be. We have some uncertainty and some risk, right? So we're trying to drive out uncertainty and risk, right? And so we hypothesized, and it's held up pretty well over the last 7, 8 years, something like that there were these four quadrants, right? So we had the predictive emergent quadrant, the predictive convergent quadrant, the adaptive convergent quadrant, and the adaptive emergent quadrant. And so what we were basically talking about, there's a lot of agile stuff you can do here, but it tends to be heavier, right? And so if I'm anchoring it to methodology, I'm thinking like DSDM, FDD, right? Sometimes we're doing almost like traditional project management. We're leaning it out a little bit, right? Because we're trying to be predictable, make and meet commitments, and we have a fairly good idea of the scope that we're trying to deliver against, and we're trying to figure out how to drive out uncertainty to optimize economic outcomes within that set of constraints. And so what was kind of fascinating about the realization of this quadrant is that this kind of aligns to the whole Gartner mode 1 thing, where we have systems of record. A lot of times we have mainframe systems that have to operate in this quadrant. And so sometimes like the business drivers keep you in this quadrant, but sometimes technical dependencies keep you in this quadrant as well, right? Up here we have the idea of we're built for change, We are working on requirements that emerge, lots of volatility in maybe what we're going to build or we're going to be done, a lot of experimentation, right? Really a great quadrant for more like a lean startup kind of way of looking at things, right? Small team of people totally own their technology, not a lot of dependencies between things. And we can say, hey, here's this problem to go solve. What I want you to do is just solve it in the most creative, economically advantageous way possible, right? And so that's where I kind of think about like lean startup. And down here, we had the idea of, pure play agile, right? So the family of methodologies kind of live in here, right? So less and, Scrum and XP, probably even, put safe in here, right? That kind of stuff. And so this is where the family of methodologies comes in. And the story that we were trying to tell is that most organizations, when they want to do Agile, are usually starting in this predictive emergent quadrant. At least that's what it feels like, because they're built for predictability, but things are changing all the time. And so what we were kind of hypothesizing is that you have one of two choices. You either go ahead and you build a team in that quadrant, create the conditions, give it greenfield, right? All those different things. And what you'll find is that regardless of methodology you choose, if you build a team that is wired and set up, kind of from an ecosystem perspective to operate that way, the methodology just becomes an enabler of that. So lean startup, if you're going to do Scrum, like whatever, right? Because you've created the conditions for that methodology to thrive. Problem is that oftentimes we do that and then we mistake the methodology for what actually made it successful, right? So we take that methodology, we bring it back into this unstructured way of working, and it creates a lot of chaos. Okay. And this is kind of what we're seeing a lot right now when we go in to engage with a company around Agile, because almost nobody's new to Agile anymore, right? People are doing Agile. And so they get Scrum, they send people to Scrum Master training, or maybe they've had Safe Consultants in and are doing something. And that's good, right? Because it's like the industry is advancing and almost nobody is unaware at this point. But the problem is that I don't think we've been explicit enough as an industry about what are the conditions that we need to create to make these methodologies successful. And so when you have these dependencies, right, the dependencies don't go away overnight. And so now I'm going to go back to the transformation journey. So the transformation journey is about forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software, understanding that dependencies don't go away overnight. And so we introduced this idea of base camps. And the idea behind base camps is that in an early stage transformation, in the presence of dependencies, in an organization that isn't aligned around teams, doesn't have agile governance, doesn't have the ability necessarily to put in a CI/CD, DevOps pipeline, right? Doesn't have the ability to put things into market safely in real time. That we have to put some compensating controls in place in order to be able to safely start to move the organization. And I don't know if this is a great metaphor, but I almost imagine it. It's like, sometimes like if you've got damage in your arm or something, or like you've had a break and it's healed funny, sometimes you almost have to like re-break it in order to get it to heal right. But in the process of re-breaking it, you just can't let it flop around, right? So you put like a cast on it, right? And so like these early stages of transformation oftentimes are like a cast. It's like we want to form teams. We want to put like working tested software into place. We want to be able to start aligning our governance, but we know we have all these dependencies. So we're going to put some structures in place to be able to manage the dependencies, okay? Because the first step in a transformation often is to, and I'm going to put one down here, is to get predictable. Okay. And I had a conversation. We're starting to do, I don't know if we mentioned this last week, but you're going to start to see, we're going to do a set of companion podcasts. So Dave Pryor, who works with us, is our CST on the staff and works with Jim Cundiff in our training practice. He does podcasts for us. And so we did a podcast earlier this week and we were talking about predictability and the idea of in order to get the organization to work with you and to partner with you in terms of being able to engage in this agile way of working, you have to be able to make and meet commitments, right? You have to be able to like kind of call your shots, whether it be 2 weeks at a time or release at a time, even thematically at a roadmap level, right? That kind of a thing. So being predictable helps us build trust. And so then we can start to focus on 2, right? Reducing batch size. Okay. And while we're tracking towards reducing batch size, in order to live over here in the Agile world, we have to start breaking dependencies. So we call that Basecamp 3. Okay. So when we get into, now we're starting to get up into more of an adaptive emergent type quadrant around Basecamp 4, maybe using less or something like that, right? We have to start being able to do funding. Right? We have to be able to do funding at the, what I'm going to say, the team or work group level. Right? Because now, like, so now you think about kind of where we're at from the teams, backlogs, working tested software. We stabilized the system in place. We put in some controls to be able to manage dependencies. We started reducing batch size. This is kind of where, just candidly, I think where SAFe kind of leaves us. Right? You could make the argument that SAFe is there. I think I've seen some SAFe implementations that are probably here. But where SAFe implementations often struggle is within a value stream, dependencies between teams. But then also you start to see dependencies between value streams. And so whenever there's dependencies, that reduces agility. And so what we often observe is that you form the teams, you put in the compensating controls, you're getting better at reducing batch size, but the dependencies are creating volatility in your ability to deliver, right? It's really difficult to make and meet commitments. And so when you're talking about Basecamp 3, we're talking about breaking dependencies, right? So these teams or value streams or work groups can operate more independently. And at the point that I have them operating independently, I can start to adjust the funding strategy so that I can begin putting dollars into these independent work groups and getting outcomes as a result of the dollars spent, right? So I start getting better business benefit from putting dollars into these delivery organizations, right? As you might imagine, that's like a journey, right? It's really tough to kind of do overnight. And then, right, and not, this isn't for everybody, right? But what we call Basecamp 5 is what I like to think of as invest to learn. Okay, so what do I mean by invest to learn? Well, at this point, right, you might be putting dollars in to solve a problem that you don't know if you can necessarily solve. You might be putting dollars in to advance a backlog forward that you're not sure if a customer actually wants, right? And so the difference, right? So we've stabilized the system and we've started putting things into market faster so that we can get feedback. This is often like a really good strategy, like I said, for mainframe teams, places where there's lots of dependencies, but you end up inevitably with like multi-tier architectures and some of the heaviness of SAFe and some, really explicit coordination dependencies, some further out road mapping because you have to be able to start to anticipate some of the architectural runway kinds of things, right? And so all of that stuff is necessities of dependencies. As you start to break dependencies, right, you can continue to operate in that governance way, but you buy yourself some more flexibility because these work units, right, the teams or the feature groups or the work groups or the value streams, right, they're not connected, right? So it's way less complicated. And so theoretically, you should be able to deprecate some of those compensating controls and start to reduce the cost of your orchestration layers, right? And then once you've done that, then you can start to think about how to exploit that with new funding models that fund those delivery units. And then if you want, you can start to run experiments within those delivery units that allow you to advance your markets in ways that you couldn't necessarily anticipate. So you say, what's the difference between 4 and 5? I would like to say that in 4, there is like an expectation of scope maybe. right? There's this set of capabilities that we think we can build on this roadmap that are going to enable the organization and allow us to bring products to market that we think are fairly well understood. Still risk, still some uncertainty, a lot of inspecting and adapting, a lot of small batches and things like that. Whereas 5 can be disruptive innovation, it can be more experimentation. So I think about like what we're doing with, we have 2 internal products we're working on. One we call Navigator that helps us run and structure our engagements. And then we have another product we call Cooperstown that is going to help us, track and pattern match employees and things like that. Both of those things were absolutely conceived as Basecamp 5 for me. Small dedicated team working with me, or one of my team members is like a product owner. And literally we invested in these products with no expectation of monetization. At some point we might monetize them, but we have no expectation of monetization, because what we were doing is it really fundamentally is spending money to be able to learn about building software and what we needed as a company. And what was kind of fun, and it's happened on both of these products, the HR product and the consulting product, is that by building the software, it helped us understand our methodology and the way that we worked together as an organization better. And so it's been very cool, right? But absolutely Basecamp 5. We started spending money, had no idea what it was we were going to get. Basecamp 4, as we move backwards along the continuum, right, there's a little bit more of an expectation that you kind of know what's going on. Okay, so that lays the foundation for kind of where we've been to date. And I know by the time we get into the 4th in the series, it's like we're trying to build and tell a story, and so there's a little bit of repeat. So now we start to think about what does it mean to kind of get in and to start planning a transformation, and what does it mean to start kind of orchestrating a transformation? Actually, I realized I just left something out, so I'm going to go back real quick. So we want to do that, but what we've got, right, is we've got organizations that need to move through these base camps. So I skipped over the idea of an expedition. And so we decided to coin the word expedition as a group of teams that move through an agile transformation journey together. And so for us, what that looks like, this is kind of how we tend to think about it, right? Is you might start with like a hypothesis of like what the work group kind of looks like, or what the value stream looks like, or maybe it's a product or something. But usually there is some sort of, or you want to install some sort of team-based organizational structure. And then that organizational structure is going to operate within some form of governance model. And it's going to produce a set of metrics, right? Burn down charts, flow diagrams, cumulative flow diagrams, right? Whatever. That's going to indicate the operational performance of the organization. Right? So we have governance, we have our structure, and we have our metrics. And the expedition for us is a vertical slice of the organization that is inclusive of structure, governance, and metrics. Early on when we started coining these ideas, like, so we'd come in and we'd say, okay, here's kind of the execution focused product and services teams. We had program, or we call them product teams now more commonly, but we had product teams. And then we had like the governance frame. And people would come up to me and say, oh, okay, well, we got the teams to Basecamp 1 because they were predictable. But doesn't count, right? What we care about, because it's what the organization cares about, is we want the entire expedition, right? The whole vertical slice that we're looking at moving to Basecamp 1, which means that the teams are predictable, the flow of value across the teams is predictable, the outcomes at the portfolio layer are predictable, the metrics are well understood. They're being measured and used to inform delivery. They're being used to realign strategic objectives and to help us meet our overall goals as a company. Okay? And so when we talk about an expedition, we're talking about this entire vertical slice and moving it to a defined state of operational excellence or operational performance. Right? And so what we've been thinking about, right, the way we talk about it, is that the unit of value of an agile transformation is an expedition moving to a base camp, right? So if you thought about, right? So if you thought about the unit of value being an expedition moving through a base camp, think of it as like an epic moving through a Kanban board through your governance model, right? So if I had a portfolio level Kanban, and let's say I had 4 stage gates, right? So I'm just going to call it gate 1, gate 2, gate 3, gate 4, right? Back in the early days, I think I've talked about this before, and I don't want to freak anybody out, but we used to build the top level of our governance in like using RUP phases, because the organization that I was working in at the time was basically waterfall to Agile or waterfall to RUP to Agile. That was kind of was the path that we were on, and so we used the idea of elaboration. Excuse me, got that wrong. It's like the downside of live TV, right? We've got inception, we've got elaboration, we have construction, we have transition, right? And so what I thought was rather elegant about this way of thinking about things is that we would have an epic, which is really a collection of features, right? Something that had value. At the time, we'd kind of think of it as being about 2 to 3 to 4 months big. We would move it through this Kanban and we would say, okay, we're going to do enough work to validate the business problem, and then it's going to move here, and then we're going to do enough work to validate the technical architecture, do the walking skeleton, what do they call it, like the tracer bullets through, right? Make sure that we can actually have a solution that we can deliver within the time and cost constraints. And then we're going to move it into construction, which is really as close to kind of Agile as you get kind of in this frame, right? We're going to iterate every 2 weeks and deliver product to our product owner. And then we're going to move it into the market and we're going to get feedback from our customers, right? So this was really kind of the customer phase. So that's kind of how we model typically a portfolio level Kanban. So if you think about an Agile transformation at the epic level, the expedition to base camp level, right? You could kind of look at it a couple different ways, right? So you might think about it like this. Let's say we have like a readiness step, an assessment step, and then we have base camp 1, base camp 2, and then I'm just going to end this one at base camp 3 because not everybody goes to base camp 5. So then we have something like the epic ends up being something to the effect of, let's say it's the payments processing organization, right? Payments processing, right? Just making that up. Totally irrelevant, right? But it's something that the organization values. Right, so we hypothesize, right? We have like an epic brief. We hypothesize that the payments processing organization is going to go on this journey. So we kind of look for do they have funding? Do they have the commitment of leadership? Do they have all the right pieces in place? What's the state of their dependencies, right? All that kind of stuff. And so there's probably a step where the payments processing group is in a readiness phase. And then it's going through let's look at the business architecture. Let's look at the current governance model. Let's look at a bunch of different things, right? And then we are going to decide what we want the base camp 1 end state to look like. And then so we start moving it towards base camp 1, and we are going to put in, our structure. We're going to put in our governance. Right? We're going to install our metrics. We're going to install our compensating controls. We're going to start doing road mapping, right? All that kind of stuff. We're managing dependencies effectively, right? We get to that state, and then we can decide we want payments processing to go to base camp 2. And it basically would be like, okay, we have to start leaning out our release management. We have to start changing some of our procedures. We have to start working on smaller batches at the portfolio level, right? All kinds of different things, because we know what the goal of base camp 2 is to reduce batch size and get things into market faster. Depending upon the organization, sometimes there's an opportunity to flip from a projects to products kind of frame of reference going to Basecamp 2. And then, we've probably been doing some work on this in Basecamp 1 and Basecamp 3, or Basecamp 2, but by the time we get to Basecamp 3, we want payments processing to have independent teams and to be operating with some autonomy, and probably looking to deprecate some of the compensating controls and some of the heavyweight governance and road mapping, planning, dependency management that we've done. Okay, so that's what like the flow looks like. So you have this idea of epics, which are vertical cross-sectional slices of the organization, moving through a Kanban, where the state of the organization moves to a quantifiable place, right, in kind of a flow-based way, right? So what do we know about like Kanban and flow, right? So there's a couple of principles, right? So we want to make sure that we are focusing on getting work finished before we get more work started. We want to, in effect, limit WIP. We want to focus on flow. We know that in a Kanban, the token has to move, right? The token can't sit in a state, right? Token has to move. Okay. And so like, I think it's probably more complicated than that, but that's like really about as simple as it gets, right? So we know that maybe the readiness step, right? We can say, well, maybe this is, anticipated to be about 2 weeks, assessments about 6 weeks. We know that we probably don't want the journey to Basecamp 1 to really be much more than about 3 to 4 months. Right? The journey to Basecamp 2 probably needs to be about 3 to 4 months. The journey to Basecamp 3 probably about 3 to 4 months to get them into these ready states. And so if I'm an executive and I'm looking at the transformation story, what I can do is I can see what is my backlog of organizations that need to move through the system, which ones are in the readiness state, which ones are in the assessment state, which ones are in the process of moving to Basecamp 1, Basecamp 2, and Basecamp 3. And so as that executive, I should be able to understand the performance characteristics of the organization and be able to look at, if they have achieved Basecamp 1 and they're moving to Basecamp 2, right? Are they able to make and meet commitments in market? By the time they exit Basecamp 2, I should be able to see, are they able to deliver something every 2, 4, 6 weeks, right? That kind of a thing. If I'm in Basecamp 3, should I be able to see measurable cost in the coordination of dependencies? That kind of stuff, okay? And so the unit of value is the epic. The states that it's moving through are the Basecamps, in effect, and I should be able to see the effects of organizational performance as an expedition moves through a Basecamp. Right, so that to me is the highest level of transformation planning. And I'm fairly guilty and have been for a long time and probably still am. It kind of blows me away sometimes. Like to me, I go like, okay, that's like super intuitive, just go do it. But, we're about 80 or 90 consultants, about 120 people as a company. And people come and go, and we're hiring new people all the time. And as you might imagine, it's not immediately obvious how you take a company or an organization or slice of an organization from where it is now to where it needs to be in the future. And so in a moment of frustration, like we were sitting down. Oh, so I'll actually give you a backstory because this will tie into something I said earlier. So the Navigator product that I've mentioned, which is one of our 2 products that we have in development internally here and using it on site with some of our clients, is I created this this part of the app which we called Builder. And it was really basically like, it was kind of 5 columns, right? We're getting ready to hire a UI person to come in and help us refactor some of this stuff because you don't really want me building UI. But it was kind of like the way it was. So this was kind of a queue of expeditions, right? And then this was, like imagine if you highlighted this one, these are the base camps that it's intended to go to. And then I had this intuitive sense that what were the outcomes associated with getting to that base camp? Okay. And this is what I'm going to drill into here in a second. And then we did some things with like, okay, what dollars were we allocating to outcomes? Because we basically want to be able to say we're spending this much money and we're achieving these goals. And then we had this idea activities. And so we were trying to create some visualizations for how we decomposed the work on a transformation project. And what was fascinating is we probably had 7 or 8 accounts that were running at the time. I want to say when we first did this, we were maybe 40 or 50 people, right? So we were, about a third of the size that we are now. And what was fascinating is I asked my team to go in and to load up, what do you see as an expedition? What do you see as the base camp they're going to? And what do you see as the outcomes that they're trying to achieve? And what we learned is that while I'm talking about this all the time in public and we're, ad nauseum talking about it internally, not everybody really understood what it was that we were actually trying to do. And it wasn't until we had actually built this product that we actually learned that, right? So that's why I wanted to connect back to the product, because we actually built the product not only as a tool to help us manage our engagements, but what it's really done is it's helped us be really explicit about how we manage engagements. And so out of that, right, was kind of interesting is I sat down with Dennis Stevens, who, if you guys haven't been to one of his lean coffees, you guys should really go. Literally the smartest guy I know. He and I have co-created a lot of the stuff together over the last 10 years. Super depth, right? Like mad scientist, 160 something IQ, like really, really super smart. So he and I got together in my office and we were talking about, so what does it look like if I'm going to go from, what we'll just call base camp 0 to base camp 1? Okay. What would the step be? Because the other thing that we see, and we were falling victim to this in our early days too, but we see it in industry quite a bit, is this idea of, we kind of call it, we just show up and coach, right? And so the idea is I'm an Agile coach, and I'm going to show up and I'm going to teach people Scrum and I'm going to work with them in the team room and we're going to get better at Scrum. And then if we're doing something at like an integration layer, we might say, okay, well, we're going to work on, multi-team decomposition kinds of stuff, right? Think of almost like safe big room planning, right? The difference between team level, safe big room planning. And you go, okay, cool, right? So we're going to go up and we're going to show up and we're going to coach. And under the best of circumstances, right, coaching works and everybody's good and they get the business outcomes they want. But what if you showed up and coached and the organization didn't get the business outcomes they wanted because the dependencies within the value stream or the dependencies between value streams were so great that it just froze? Right. And I think happens a lot is that we get in this mode where it's almost like a blame the client mode, or it's like a blame the team kind of mode. Oh, they weren't ready for Agile, or they weren't Agile enough, or the leadership didn't get it, or something like that. And what we figured out, I'm a huge Christopher Avery fan too, right? So I'm huge into personal responsibility. And if I'm going to be a coach in somebody's organization as a permanent employee or as a consultant, I don't want to just coach and wing it. I need to know whether I'm actually moving the organization forward. And so we sat down and we said, okay, so what if we decomposed these base camps, expeditions to base camps down into the next level of detail? And so we started down this path that is since we coin as outcomes-based planning. And I'm going to have to reference a cheat sheet that Dennis sent over to me because it's been a few years since we invented this and I don't do it day to day, but I want to put some teeth into this so you guys can see what I'm talking about, because I tend to talk thematically about stuff in these sessions, but I think this is an opportunity to really get into some specificity. Okay, so if you think about the epic, right? The epic as Expedition 1 to Base Camp 1. The features are the outcomes, okay? And so this is where I'm going to take my notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? So I'm going to come up with 9. I'm going to put 9 features here. 6, 7, 8, 9, okay? And so think about this as like a story decomposition kind of a thing, right? So the epic is Expedition 1 to Basecamp 1, payments processing to Basecamp 1. And then what we're basically going to do is we're going to do a team identification step, right? And then we're going to form teams. And then we're going to basically establish, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, establish flow, but I want to get it up on my screen and off this little PowerPoint I have it on the side. I want to establish flow. Then we want to be able to make and meet commitments, right? And then we want to optimize the system. And then we want to have stable throughput. We want to be able to build a product roadmap, right? We want to be able to deliver release plans, right? And then we want to be able to have a rolling 90-day backlog. Okay, so this is one path, right? And so here's the risk, right? And having some of these conversations. So we've enumerated, because our market and our customers have asked us to, what Basecamp 1 through Basecamp 5 is. For the same reason, we've enumerated what are the outcomes required to get to Basecamp 1. Your mileage may vary, right, in your particular part of the organization. We've found that thinking about it this way and actually using these outcomes is a fairly resilient and transferable way between different expeditions and different clients and different business units and things. But it's the pattern that I want you guys to focus on, not the specifics of the pattern. So use the pattern as an example, or the specifics as an example of the pattern. So if you really think about, like in a really intuitive sense, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come in and we're trying to say, okay, let's create a hypothesis for how we're going to form these teams, right? And we're going to start forming them. We're going to start training them. We're going to start doing a bunch of stuff. You can, make the acceptance criteria of this anything that you want it to be. And then, like, the outcome is going to be that we have actually formed these units of 6 to 8 people that have like a singular problem. So we're going to take everything we know about what is a great Agile team, what is the foundational, what makes an Agile team work, right? All that kind of stuff, right? All that coaching and knowledge and blah, 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 right? We're going to instill and push into the organization. But the outcome is those teams have to be formed, right? If we've done the work, but we haven't formed the teams, then you don't get credit for it. And I know I'm using some heavy language, but so just give me a little bit of grace. But it's like, it's either done or not done, right? You either get the story points, you don't get the story points. And the story points aren't, I've trained the team. The story point isn't, I've coached the team. The story point is I have teams formed, right? Because if I don't have teams, then I'm never going to stabilize velocity. I'm never going to, like, all these different things, right? So I want to form the teams. And then I want to, by virtue of building backlogs, installing governance, right, doing all the different alignment activities, right, all that stuff, I want to establish flow across those teams, which basically means that I'm going to take epics and decompose them into features and features into user stories. And I'm going to sequence all of the user stories in such a way with my product owners such that features flow across and epics flow across. Now, imagine there's a lot of work and a lot of coaching that has to go into being able to establish flow. But I only get points if flow is established. And we can have metrics to define what actually flow is. Can the organization make and meet commitments, right? So maybe I'm established flow, but it's erratic flow, or it's not a predictable flow, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that probably has to happen in order to be able to make and meet commitments. Once we've got the ability to have flow and the ability to make and meet commitments, there might be some improvements that we need to make. So we put this optimize the system step in. Then we want our metrics to stabilize throughput, right? So we want to have batch size become more consistent. And then we want to have the rate at which we can drop things into market be very predictable. So cycle time starts to stabilize, right? All that kind of stuff. So think about it. From about here to about here, we are establishing the ability to form teams, build backlogs, produce working tested software, to start thinking about how we're going to align with governance, how we're going to start to tie the product into the program, into the portfolio, right? We're starting to tighten up a little bit. We're starting to establish stable, cycle times, tack time, things like that, right? So that's what's happening in these first set of outcomes. And then once we have the ability to stabilize throughput, now we can start thinking about, well, what does a roadmap look like, right? So now if we're good at decomposing work and stabilizing throughput, now we can start to anticipate a little bit farther forward. At the point we can anticipate farther forward, then we can start to create really solid release plans. At the point that we have really solid release plans, then we can start doing 90-day rolling backlogs. And this is kind of, to me, the holy grail of a Basecamp 1 set of outcomes. Really predictable teams, really stable flow, really precise metrics. And then that gives us the ability to start looking a little bit more forward and start to anticipate dependencies and start to communicate where we're going to be, right? Totally Basecamp 1. Might say that's not Agile. Okay, cool, right? So what we're defining here is what is a Basecamp 1 set of Agile outcomes. And what was really cool about that is it kind of exposed the next set of stuff, right? So just like we talked about the idea that the organization, like an Epic, let's say we said payments processing, Expedition 1 going to Basecamp 1, right? It has a set of steps that it goes through, right? Because work has to flow. Work can't sit in queue indefinitely, right? All of the stuff, get work finished versus work started, right? All the lean stuff we talked about a minute ago, right? Expeditions were kind of the same thing too, right? And so what my team started off doing is they took all 9 of the epic or the outcomes, and they basically put them in a Gantt chart, right? I'm telling you, Agilists are crazy, right? We know all this stuff and we teach it, but the reality is when it comes to our own work, often we are not great at applying incremental and iterative delivery to ourselves, right? And so this is what we were doing, right? So we were sitting there and basically outcome 1, it took the whole time, and then outcome 2 took the whole time, right? And then what everybody wanted me to do was to build basically Gantt chart functionality. Wanted me to turn our Navigator product into Microsoft project. And the challenge was, right, is that the reality is these outcomes, they are like a Kanban as well, right? So outcomes, right, flow through. I'm going to reference our Pister model here. I'm not going to be able to get it, but it's they basically flow through a process of planning and socialization and, getting out in front of the customers. And my brain goes blank in front of all you guys, right, is what Pister stands for. We can actually ask Dennis when you do the Lean Coffee to talk about Pister a little bit more. But basically outcomes run through a planning, socialization, kind of getting ready, executing kind of framework as well, right? And so you can have more than one outcome moving through the Kanban. WIP might be 3, right? WIP might be 5, right? I don't know. But the idea is that just like we want features to flow through a system, in a queue, we want outcomes to flow through a system. Because as you guys are investing coaching dollars, consulting dollars, permanent or external, right, the expectation is that the organization is achieving those outcomes. And then, so it's cool, right? So we have our epics decomposing into our outcomes, and the outcomes decompose, we call them activities, right? But activities, right? But it's really at the user story level, right? And so a user story might be something like run a workshop, or it might be transfer these knowledge and skills, or it might be pair with this team and make sure that they understand how to write unit tests, right? It could be 1,000 different things, right? But here's the kicker, right? If the activities don't roll up into the outcomes, don't roll up into the Basecamp moving to an expedition, then it doesn't matter, right? Because if it doesn't roll up, all we did was show up and coach. Okay. And so what you got to think about when you're starting to build this, right? It's just like you have, this is beyond the scope of what we're talking about. We have this whole set of talks. Tim can probably drop a link or something. We have this deck that's kind of emerging from our Elevate Agile conference and Elevate Agile program, where we're trying to communicate to folks about like how to really think about Agile and Agile transformation really at scale, like really super big picture, business agility, digital transformation, and all that kind of stuff. And so like what we've kind of coined is this idea of like system of delivery versus system of transformation. And then just kind of as an aside, we have this idea of system of continuous improvement and system of engagement. But what we're really talking about is we're seeing a really tight parallel, a system of delivery, think like SAFe, right? This is how we're going to structure teams. This is how we're going to govern. This is what we're going to measure and control, right? All that kind of stuff, right? And then the system of transformation has an analog on its side as well, right? There are teams that do or go through the transformation work. There's a queue of expeditions moving through to base camps. There's outcomes that move through Peaster. There's the quarterly or biweekly scheduling of different coaching activities, right? But the kicker is that we want everything we're doing at the coaching level to roll up into the outcomes, and the outcomes to roll up into this idea of an expedition moving to a base camp. And so like what we've started to do, and we found a lot of success in doing this. It's really kind of cool when you look at kind of how we structure maybe an engagement with people. So we have a set of outcomes, like in a 2-day workshop. We have a little bit of what we do. We call define the end state. And then we have like, maybe like a pilot of expedition 1 to base camp 1, right? That kind of a thing. And it's really powerful because you can sit down and go, okay, we measure these in hours, right? But are we achieving the outcomes of the workshop that we want? Or are we just running through the material? Through the define the end state, you have about an outcome due pretty much like every week. It has to do with like gathering product information, gathering org charts, synthesizing business architecture, hunting for dependencies, looking for gaps in governance, right? All these kinds of different things. And so we have a set of outcomes and define the end state. And then just like what we just went through, right? We have these 9 major outcomes of moving an expedition into a base camp. And, for us, right, this is kind of a mix of system of transformation, system of engagement stuff for us. But the idea is that when you think about it this way, right, and I'm actually being cognizant of time because we have like 7 minutes left. When you think about it this way, this idea that in a transformation, the expedition moving to the base camp is the unit of value, and that's like an epic. And then that decomposes into outcomes, which are measurable and that the business cares about. Those outcomes basically decompose into the coaching activities that we hypothesize are going to deliver that outcome. And then we start to think about moving those units of value through Kanban or Scrum type queues with their own measures of performance and their own, completion metrics, acceptance criteria. Did it actually achieve the outcome that we wanted to? How do we prove it, right? All that kind of stuff. When you start to do that, right, what we find is that a transformation is way more like running an Agile system of delivery than we thought before. Because what I've seen most people do in the past is they say, oh, we're using Scrum to implement Scrum. And what they mean is they have like a backlog of like stuff they're doing, and they're using Scrum to coordinate that backlog. But it's the analog is just basically using Scrum to basically do task management in a team, right? If we're not producing value, if we're not producing measurable value, like it doesn't really count, okay? And so, so that's probably not a bad stopping place for today. And so just the point being, right? Point being is that if you take all of the stuff that we've talked about to date, even within just this webinar series, right? We go from the teams, backlogs, working tested software, structure, governance, metrics, 4 quadrants, to expeditions to base camps, to how to decompose, the expedition to base camp and outcomes and activities and what the queuing and all that kind of stuff does, right? It starts to give you a possibility, right? A set of possibilities for how you might orchestrate a transformation in a less than haphazard way. right? It helps us understand why when we're showing up in coaching, it's really difficult to get the executives to engage with us in a way that's meaningful because they see the coaching, but if the coaching doesn't tie to the business outcomes, right, they lose interest. So, so noodle on this, right? Noodle on it. Shoot us any questions that you have. Show up to the Lean Coffee. It's a great place to ask Dennis questions to go deep. But we're finding that this is possible, right? And it doesn't have to be totally emergent, as you might imagine, right? Stuff changes, right? And this application of the system of transformation, it feels different, group to group to group to group. But what's interesting is that the reference architecture, right, the patterns that are underneath it, I think are relatively static. There hasn't really been a place where we've gone into where this kind of approach wasn't directly applicable. Is it tough? Sure, right? Being accountable for outcomes is way more difficult than showing up and being accountable for just staying busy. Right? But as professionals, right, it's really up to us to kind of say, hey, the output of our work, especially when we're in the transformation and change game, has to be actual change and actual performance, changes to that organization, right? And that's how we win, right? It's how you guys win, it's how we win, right? It's how everybody wins when you're talking about agile transformation.
There is that one question in there talking about the range of time frame it takes for an organization to experience transformation.
Yeah, well, so it's really fascinating. There was a series I think it was the second or third webinar series we did where we talked about like resistance to change. And like, here's the hard part. It really does depend, right? It depends upon, I look at it, you can either be almost like accidentally agile, like you just happen to have really 5 distinct product lines, very few dependencies between them, wrap them in some Scrum and some lightweight Scrum of Scrums, and it's like, it's good, right? You're done in a couple weeks. You go into a large manufacturing organization with tons of business capabilities and tons of intersecting value streams and not a lot of clarity, organizational politics, right? Probably our longest running transformation, I'd probably say is at organizational base camp 1 or 2, pockets of 3, 4, and 5 in different places. And it's been like 3 or 4 years with them, right? But they're getting a tremendous amount of value out of it as we go, right? And that's the key, I think. It's like sometimes it's going to take a while, but if we can figure out how to provide incremental value and actually show tangible progress and business performance improvements as we go, right, then you have a chance to keep people's attention for a long time. One of the things Chris Beal, who's our head of consulting now at Leading Agile, talks about is he'll walk in with prospects for us and go, it's going to be hard, it's going to be messy, but it's going to be worth it. And that's the challenge, right? Everybody wants an easy button. It's like go train people in Scrum and it's going to be great. Untangling tangled up organizations is tough, and that's really what we're talking about. So when we really talk about change, what we're really talking about is creating the conditions for change, right? So going back to that third webinar series, right? It's like structure, practices, culture, right? We got to get the organizational structure, including the governance, including the metrics, right? All that stuff, the teams and everything, and then enable it with your great process, right? Whether it be safe, less, Scrum, what have you. And then culture emerges. But while all that's happening, we got to be measuring and controlling and making sure that we're communicating the value that we're delivering. Okay, guys, thanks. Peace out.